In a city like that, opening your door to a stranger could cost you your life. Yet when someone pounded so hard at 2 in the afternoon that the cheap hinges of her apartment door began to rattle, Claire Bennett realized there was no longer any point pretending she was not home. She approached the peephole and saw a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than the full payout on her life insurance policy. He was not a police officer. The cops in that neighborhood arrived in wrinkled uniforms, with dark circles under their eyes and mud on their shoes. This man, by contrast, stood perfectly still, as though every inch of concrete beneath his feet belonged to him. Claire drew a deep breath and slid off the chain. It had all begun a few hours earlier. The faulty clock on the dashboard of her old Honda Civic read 3:14 in the morning. The digits flickered, yet another warning that the alternator was dying and that replacing it would cost money she did not have. Rain hammered the windshield with almost solid force. The worn wipers did not clear the glass. They merely shoved the water from one side to the other. Claire felt hollow. A 12-hour shift in the emergency department at Mercy General Hospital had drained the last drop of patience from her body. She smelled of cheap coffee, disinfectant, and that faint metallic trace of blood that never completely left medical scrubs. All she wanted was to reach her apartment, collapse onto her bed, and sink into the heavy, dreamless sleep of people who worked too much and earned too little. She turned onto Harbour Point Avenue, a deserted road skirting the industrial district. Nearly every streetlight was broken, leaving the headlights of her car as the only thing cutting through the darkness. That was when she saw him. At first, he looked like another shadow beneath the rusted roof of an abandoned bus stop. Then she made out a small body curled up on a concrete bench. Claire brushed the brake by instinct. The tires hissed across the wet pavement. She narrowed her eyes, trying to see through the water-soaked windshield. It was a child. He could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old. He sat with his knees drawn to his chest, wrapped in a dark blue jacket so thoroughly soaked that it clung to his thin body. Claire swore. Inside the car, her own voice sounded harsh and exhausted. She told herself to keep driving. She could call social services or notify the police. Someone else could deal with it. Her shift was over, but her foot refused to obey. She drove a few yards, glanced into the rearview mirror, and saw the boy's shoulders trembling from a cold. In that part of the city, a patrol car could take more than an hour to answer an emergency that did not involve a corpse. By then, the child would already be hypothermic. Claire shifted into reverse. The transmission protested with a metallic grind. She lowered the passenger window a few inches, and a burst of freezing rain immediately swept inside. "Hey!" she shouted. The boy did not flinch. He turned his head slowly. In the dim dashboard light, his face looked so pale it was almost transparent. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were not the terrified eyes of a lost child. They were calm, alert, and strangely empty of fear. "Where are your parents?" Claire asked, using the firm, soothing voice she reserved for patients in shock. The boy watched her without answering. "You cannot stay out here," she continued as she unlocked the door. "Get in. I will turn the heat all the way up." For several seconds, the child studied the car. He looked at the empty street, then at the running engine. Finally, he slid off the bench, walked to the Honda, and opened the door. He climbed in without a word. He brought with him the smell of wet wool, mud, and night rain. He closed the door carefully. Most children would have slammed it. He did not. "My name is Claire," she said, twisting the heater control. The vents groaned and released barely warm air. "What is yours?" "Noah." His voice was astonishingly steady. Not a single tremor. "All right, Noah. Do you know your address or either of your parents' phone numbers? I can take you to a police station, and from there—" "No police," he interrupted. It did not sound like a child's plea. It sounded like an order. "Take me to number 400 on Hawthorne Ridge Drive." Claire's hand froze above the gearshift. Hawthorne Ridge Drive was a private road in the Northern Hills, inside a gated community where the houses resembled fortresses and the annual property taxes on a single home could fund half a floor at Mercy General. It was about 40 minutes away, in the opposite direction from her apartment. "That is a long way from here. How did you get here?" Noah kept staring through the windshield, where rivers of water streamed across the glass. "I walked." Claire looked down. The boy was missing a shoe. On his left foot, he wore only a dirty, soaked sock. The truth struck her like a blow. He had walked several miles through a storm. This was not a simple family argument or a childish stunt. Something far worse had happened. "I have to report this, Noah," she said gently. "You are freezing, you are hurt, and you have lost a shoe. Someone must be looking for you." The boy turned toward her. "My father is looking for me. But if you take me to the police, the men who left me here will find me before he does. Please, take me to Hawthorne Ridge." A chill moved down her spine. The sensible part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive and employed for years, screamed at her to drive to the nearest station, leave the child beneath fluorescent lights, and walk away. But when she looked at his bruised face and drenched clothes, the nurse inside her silenced the cynic. "Put on your seat belt," she murmured. The drive passed in unbearable silence. Claire kept both hands on the wheel while the Honda lost traction twice on the flooded highway. Noah did not fall asleep. He sat far too upright for an exhausted child, watching the side mirrors and tracking the headlights of every approaching vehicle. He was not resting. He was standing guard. When they finally reached the northern hills, the warehouses, soot, and cracked streets fell behind them. In their place came immaculate lawns, towering oaks, and stone walls. The road climbed toward enormous wrought iron gates flanked by granite pillars. A security camera with glowing red lenses swung toward the Honda the instant Claire stopped. Before she could lower her window or use the intercom, the metal gates began to open without making a sound. "Stop here," Noah said. Claire pressed the brake. "I am not leaving you alone at the entrance. I will drive you to the house." "No. It is better if they do not see your car inside." He unfastened his seatbelt and opened the door. The rain had weakened to a fine drizzle, but the wind still cut through the skin. The boy stepped out and placed his shoeless foot on the wet stone of the driveway. Before closing the door, he looked back at her. "Thank you, Claire." "Wait." Claire reached into the pocket of her scrubs, pulled out a cereal bar wrapped in foil, the dinner she had never had time to eat, and tossed it to him. Noah caught it with one hand. Then he closed the door, crossed the iron threshold, and disappeared into the shadows of the vast estate. Claire stayed there until the gates closed again. Then she shifted into reverse and began the drive home, shivering inside the damp, cold interior of the Honda. She told herself she had done the right thing, that the boy was safe now, that when she woke, she would remember it only as a strange night and nothing more. She was wrong about all of it. Claire woke to the crash of heavy, rhythmic blows against wood. It was not her neighbor, Mrs. Parker, complaining about the pipes again. It sounded as though someone were trying to tear the door out along with its frame. She sat bolt upright and tangled herself in the thin, cheap sheets. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2:10 in the afternoon. She had slept a little more than 5 hours. Her head throbbed, and a dull pressure spread behind her eyes. The knocking came again, 3 sharp, measured, deliberate blows. Claire climbed out of bed and grabbed the metal flashlight she kept beside her pillow. Barefoot, she crossed the worn linoleum of the living room, holding it like a club. Her apartment was small and cramped, and it smelled faintly of dust and old books. She pressed her eye to the peephole. The air stopped in her lungs. 2 men stood in the narrow hallway. The one in back was built like a block of concrete, thick neck, massive shoulders, and eyes that inspected every door, every shadow, and every possible exit. But the man in front seemed to consume all the space around him. He was tall. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit that looked absurd against the damp, peeling yellow wallpaper. His face was angular, severe, and dangerously handsome, a beauty without warmth, made to warn rather than comfort. His dark eyes stared directly into the peephole, as though he could see through the glass and read her thoughts. Claire tightened her grip on the flashlight. She knew the faces of gang members, dealers, and addicts. Every weekend, she stitched their wounds. This man did not belong at that level. He was the kind of predator before whom all the others lowered their heads. He was no longer knocking. He was simply waiting. He knew she was there. With hands that trembled only slightly, Claire opened the deadbolt and removed the chain. She left a gap of only a few inches and braced the door with her foot. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice, rough with sleep, sounded less steady than she would have liked. The man examined her, the oversized t-shirt, the tangled hair, the white-knuckled fingers gripping the frame, and the heavy flashlight half hidden beside her leg. His expression did not change. Claire Bennett. It was not a question. His low baritone seemed to vibrate in the air between them. "Who is asking?" "Adrian Blackwood." The name meant nothing to her, though the brief irritation in the bodyguard's eyes suggested that it should have meant a great deal. "All right, Mr. Blackwood. What do you want?" Adrian did not push the door or make any move to intimidate her. He did not need to. His presence did all the work. At 3:30 this morning, a silver Honda Civic registered in your name arrived at the entrance to my property. My son stepped out of that vehicle. Claire went still. "Noah, is he all right?" The question escaped before she could invent a lie or pretend not to understand. For a fraction of a second, Adrian's mask cracked. A muscle jumped in his jaw, and something like a father's fear appeared in his eyes. It vanished almost immediately. He is alive. He has a hairline fracture in one rib, several bruises, and mild hypothermia. He has already received medical attention. Claire released the breath she had been holding, and her shoulders lowered slightly. "Good. That is good. Why did you not call the police?" The question was sharp, almost an accusation. Claire's defenses rose again. "Because he asked me not to. He said the men who had abandoned him would find him before his father did. And considering the neighborhood where he appeared and the kind of man now standing at my door, I assume he made the right decision." The silence stretched. The bodyguard shifted his weight, and the leather of his jacket creaked. Adrian lifted one hand by barely an inch. It was a tiny gesture, but enough to make the man go perfectly still. "You took a considerable risk," Adrian said. His gaze traveled over the peeling paint, cheap furniture, and flimsy locks. "My son was pulled from a vehicle 3 blocks from where you found him. The men responsible died during the confrontation. Noah escaped and walked for nearly 3 hours through the storm. If you had not stopped, he would not have survived until dawn." "So you came to thank me," Claire replied dryly. "There was no need. And, with your permission, I start another shift in 6 hours. I need to sleep." She tried to close the door. Adrian placed his palm against it. He applied no visible pressure, but the wood stopped moving as though it had struck a wall. Claire looked down at his hand, then back into his eyes. "I do not leave debts unpaid, Miss Bennet," he said, lowering his voice into a far more dangerous register. "You saved my blood. That deserves a reward." He slipped a hand inside his jacket. Claire tensed and tightened her grip on the flashlight, but he only produced a thick, immaculate white envelope. He offered it through the gap. Claire looked at the envelope and gave a bitter laugh. "No." Adrian's hand did not move. "Consider it a token of gratitude. There is enough to buy another car and move to a neighborhood where the door has real locks. I do not need your money. I picked up a child in the rain because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected to be paid. And I certainly will not take cash from a man who brings armed security to deliver a thank you note. Keep it." Adrian tilted his head, studying her as though she were a problem he had not yet decided how to solve. "Pride is an expensive luxury in this city, Miss Bennet. Are you sure you can afford it?" "I can afford the price of sleeping with a clean conscience." Claire pushed against the door again. "This conversation is over. I am glad Noah is safe. Do not come back." Adrian watched her for a long moment. Then he slowly withdrew his hand. He did not look offended. If anything, a dark spark of genuine interest had appeared in his eyes. He took out a small matte black card with a single telephone number embossed in silver and slid it into the gap beside the frame. "When you discover that a clear conscience neither pays the rent nor protects you from the darkness, call that number." He turned and walked down the hallway. His heavy footsteps echoed across the worn floor. The bodyguard gave Claire a hard look and followed him. She shut the door, threw the deadbolt, replaced the chain, and stepped back. The black card remained wedged in the frame. She did not touch it. She returned to bed, but sleep never came. On Friday nights, the emergency department at Mercy General stopped resembling a hospital and became a combat zone. Claire moved through the chaos with the automatic calm of someone who had repeated the same motions thousands of times. She cleaned an open wound in bay number 4, administered naloxone to a patient in number 7, and dodged a drunken man vomiting aimlessly in the corridor. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, bathing the suffering around her in a sickly yellow glow. It was close to 11:30 at night, and Claire had not sat down once since the beginning of her shift. At the nurse's station, she filled out a chart with a cheap ballpoint pen, forcing herself to think about dosages, schedules, and vital signs. The black card was still where Adrian had left it, buried in the frame of her apartment door. She did not want to touch it. She wanted to convince herself that the visit had never happened. Bennett! Dr. Reynolds shouted. The grey-haired trauma physician looked like a man who had been sleeping in his scrubs for years. Gunshot victim coming in. They will be here in about 10 minutes. Looks like another East Side gang fight. Prepare trauma room 1. It is already ready. Claire dropped the pen. 10 minutes later, the double doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in, pushing a stretcher. A young man lay on it with his torso tightly bandaged. The gauze was already soaked through with bright red blood. The air filled with the smell of iron and stale sweat. Male, 22 years old. One of the paramedics shouted over the noise. 2 gunshot wounds to the upper right abdomen. Blood pressure is 80/50. Lost a lot of blood in the alley. Claire slipped into the familiar rhythm. She took her place beside the stretcher with 2 intravenous lines prepared. The instant the patient was transferred onto the resuscitation table, the doors flew open again. 3 men stormed into the department. They were not paramedics. They wore baggy clothes, bandanas, and the wild-eyed expression of men running on adrenaline and methamphetamine. The one in front, a lean man with a scorpion tattooed on his neck, hurled the security guard into the wall. Where is he? Where are you keeping Tyler? His gaze swept the department and found the blood-covered stretcher inside the trauma room. There he is. Sir, you cannot go in there, Dr. Reynolds ordered, stepping into the doorway. The man did not even slow down. He pulled a black pistol from his waistband and aimed it at the doctor's chest. Get out of the way. Document. That man owes us. The entire department went silent. The drunk who had been shouting in the hallway stopped. A child crying in his mother's arms fell quiet. Only the urgent, regular beeping of the monitor connected to the wounded man remained. Claire stood frozen with a bag of saline in her hands. She stared at the gun. Her heart hammered so violently that her ribs hurt. The shooter took another step. I said move. Claire judged the distance. She was outside the line of fire, but Reynolds was not. There were no police officers in the emergency department. Every available unit had been sent to a disturbance several blocks farther south. Before the doctor could move, before the gunman's finger could finish tightening on the trigger, the automatic doors slid apart with their usual mechanical whisper. 2 men entered. They were not wearing hoodies or bandanas. They wore dark, custom-tailored suits. One was the enormous bodyguard who had accompanied Adrian to Claire's apartment. The other was slightly taller and wore his jacket open. They walked into the chaos as though crossing a hotel lobby. The shooter spun and raised his weapon. Back off, you bastards. The larger man did not blink. He did not even slow his stride. His arm moved with terrifying speed. He seized the barrel, forced it toward the ceiling, and drove the heel of his palm into the attacker's nose. The crack was sharp. The man collapsed like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The other 2 gang members froze. The second man in the suit stepped forward. He revealed a suppressed pistol held close against his side. His body shielded the weapon from the patients, and he did not point it directly at anyone. Leave, he said quietly. The 2 young men looked at their unconscious leader lying on the linoleum with blood covering his face. Then they ran for the exit. The bodyguard kicked the fallen pistol away, adjusted his shirt cuffs, and surveyed the room. Doctors, nurses, and relatives stared at him, unable to understand what they had just witnessed. His gaze found Claire. He did not smile or gesture. He simply held her eyes for 2 seconds. The message was impossible to miss. We see you. We know where you are. Then he grabbed the attacker by the collar of his jacket and dragged him out of the hospital. The department remained frozen for another 5 seconds before Dr. Reynolds found his voice. Bennett, open that saline now. Claire jolted and connected the bag with trembling hands. She continued working, helping stabilize the patient, but her thoughts were elsewhere. At last, she understood what Adrian Blackwood's visit had truly meant. He had not come merely to offer her money. He had come to mark his territory. By saving Noah, Claire had stepped into his world. The black card was not an invitation. It was a bond. When her shift ended around 8 in the morning, she stepped into the cool air. The rising sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. She walked to her Honda and stopped. At the center of the windshield, held beneath one wiper, lay a flawless white rose. There was no note. Not even. Only the flower. Claire stood in the middle of the empty parking lot and stared at it while a cold realization cut through the exhaustion lodged in her bones. She had not merely driven a lost child home. She had invited a ghost into her life. And ghosts never left simply because they were asked. She took the rose and threw it into a trash container. It landed on a coffee-stained foam cup and a pile of damp napkins. She drove to her apartment without turning on the radio. The Honda's heater barely held back the morning cold. Once home, she finally pulled the black card from the doorframe. She did not call. She threw it into the kitchen trash, on top of eggshells and used coffee grounds. She wanted her life back, the double shifts, the familiar exhaustion, the overdue rent, and the car that stalled at traffic lights. She did not need white roses or silent men dressed like executives. For 3 days, the universe seemed to accept her decision. Mercy General returned to its ordinary chaos. The Honda kept coughing at every red light. Her neighbors resumed arguing behind the thin walls. Routine wrapped around her once more like a heavy, suffocating, but familiar blanket. Then Thursday came. Claire had the day off and was at a self-service laundromat called Wash and Dry on 4th Street. It was a grey cinder-block building permanently steeped in the smell of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. Sitting on a cracked plastic chair, she watched her scrubs tumble inside an industrial dryer. The steady thump of the drum was the only sound in the empty room. Outside, the sky had turned dark violet, swollen with another storm. The bell over the door chimed. 2 men entered. Claire did not lift her head from the worn paperback in her hands, but she tracked every movement through her peripheral vision. They had not come to wash clothes. They carried no baskets or bags. Despite the damp heat, both wore heavy canvas jackets, and their boots left dark marks of water and mud across the linoleum. They passed the front counter and walked directly down the aisle between the machines. Toward her. Claire's pulse quickened. She kept her eyes on the book, her thumb motionless between 2 pages. Claire Bennett. The voice was rough and worn down by tobacco. She finally looked up. The man who had spoken was thin, with pale skin and a face covered in small scars. His companion remained 2 steps behind him, blocking the way out. One hand rested inside his jacket pocket. "Depends who is asking," Claire replied. Her voice came out steady, though she gripped the book so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "We only want to talk," the thin man said as he came closer. "About the boy you picked up a few nights ago on Harbour Point Avenue." Suddenly, there did not seem to be enough air in the laundromat to breathe. Adrian had said the men responsible for the kidnapping were dead. He had not mentioned partners, friends, or a second gang. "I do not know what you are talking about," Claire said, closing the book and standing. "I am a nurse, and I take the bus to work." She grabbed the handle of a wire laundry cart and tried to move between them. The thin man caught the rim of the cart and locked it in place. "Do not play stupid, sweetheart. We got the plate from a traffic camera. Silver Honda. We know you picked up Blackwood's son. We only want to know what he told you before he got home." "He said the heater in my car was terrible," Claire lied. "Now let go of the cart. My boss would rather hear it directly from you." He did not smile. His dirty fingers closed around Claire's shoulder with brutal force. "You are coming with us." Adrenaline cut through her body like a blade. Claire did not scream. In that neighborhood, screams only made people lock their doors more securely. She moved. With her free hand, she seized an industrial bottle of bleach from a folding table. She made one short turn and smashed the heavy bottom of the container directly into the man's face. There was a crack. He roared, clapped both hands over his broken nose, and released a shoulder. Claire drove the metal cart forward with all her weight. Its edge slammed into the second man's knees and threw him back against a row of washing machines. She did not wait to see whether they fell. She vaulted over a table, landed on the other side, and sprinted toward the emergency exit. A shout sounded behind her. Then came the unmistakable blast of a gunshot. The thick glass door of a dryer exploded, scattering the floor with sparks and fragments. Claire slammed the metal bar of the fire door and burst into the alley. The damp air struck her lungs like a wet towel. She ran. She raced past overflowing dumpsters, her worn sneakers slipping on wet asphalt stained with grease. She did not look back until she reached the main avenue and disappeared among a group of pedestrians waiting for the traffic light to change. She kept walking with her head down and her chest burning. She did not stop until she was about 4 blocks from the laundromat. She took shelter in the recessed entrance of a closed grocery store. Her hands were trembling so violently that she could barely feel her fingers. She could not call the police. If those men had access to municipal traffic cameras and knew Adrian Blackwood's name, the station itself might be compromised. She could not return to her apartment either. They almost certainly had her address. An ordinary woman had just become trapped in the middle of a war she did not understand. Claire slipped a hand into the back pocket of her jeans. Her fingers touched a small, rigid rectangle. She froze. She had thrown the black card into the trash. She remembered perfectly watching it fall onto the eggshells. Yet 3 days earlier, while taking out the bag, she had found it clean and undamaged among the garbage. A cold, practical corner of her mind had forced her to retrieve it and put it in her pocket. Now she held it beneath the weak glow of a street lamp. The matte surface absorbed the light. The silver numbers seemed to float above it. Pride ordered her to throw it into the gutter. Survival ordered her to dial. An old payphone stood on the corner, miraculously intact after years of vandalism. Claire inserted a quarter and dialed the number. It rang once. Speak. It was not Adrian. The voice was dry and professional. "This is Claire Bennett," she said, struggling to control her breathing. "I was told to call this number if I need it." There was a 2-second pause. "Where are you?" "At the corner of 8th and Elm, beside a closed grocery store." "Get off the street." 3 minutes. The call ended. Claire hung up and pressed her back against the brick wall. She pulled her jacket tighter and watched every passing car. Every movement made her flinch as she waited for the man with the broken nose to appear around the corner with a gun in his hand. Exactly 3 minutes later, a matte black SUV glided to the curb. It did not brake sharply. It seemed to materialize out of the traffic. The rear door opened a few inches. Claire climbed in without hesitation and pulled it shut behind her. The interior smelled of expensive leather and a faint, woody cologne. The dark windows erased the city completely. The enormous bodyguard she had seen in the hallway of her building sat in the front passenger seat. He did not turn around. "Drive, Grant," a voice beside her ordered.
Claire spun in surprise.
Adrian Blackwood sat at the far end of the rear seat. The privacy partition between the front and back was raised. He wore a charcoal grey suit without a tie, the top button of his shirt undone. In the dim cabin light, his face looked carved from granite. He held a crystal glass of whiskey and appeared entirely calm. "You are bleeding," he said. It was not an observation. It sounded like an accusation. Claire touched her cheek. Her fingertips came away wet. A shard from the dryer must have cut her while she was running. She had not even felt it. "I had a difference of opinion at the laundromat." She tried to sound strong, but her voice trembled. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving an icy emptiness behind. Adrian placed his glass in the holder and leaned toward her. Claire tensed, but he only drew a white linen handkerchief from his inner pocket and offered it. She pressed it to the cut. There were 2 of them. They had my license plate. They wanted to know what Noah told me. "Dominic Shaw's men," Adrian said quietly. The name seemed to leave ash in his mouth. His gaze dropped to the stain of blood spreading across the handkerchief. "They cornered me. One grabbed my arm," Claire continued. "I broke his nose with a bottle of bleach." For an instant, the corner of Adrian's mouth twitched with an almost invisible smile. It vanished before it could fully form and was replaced by glacial stillness. "Did they shoot at you?" "Yes." Adrian leaned back against the leather seat. He did not shout. He did not pull out his phone or begin barking furious orders. His silence was far more terrifying. It was the silence of a man calculating precisely where the next bullet should land. Your apartment is no longer safe. Neither is the hospital. To them, you are unfinished business, and they will try to close it. The reality of her ruined life finally crashed down on Claire. What am I supposed to do? I have a job, a lease, bills. I cannot simply vanish overnight. You already have. Adrian said it without changing his tone. Grant's team is at your apartment collecting what you need. The hospital administration has been notified that, because of a family emergency, you will be taking an indefinite leave of absence. Claire stared at him in disbelief. For several seconds, anger displaced fear. When did you do all of that? I called you less than 10 minutes ago. I prepared it 3 days ago, Adrian corrected. When I saw that you had thrown away my card, I knew Shaw's men would eventually find your trail. You were too proud to accept protection willingly, so I prepared for the moment when you no longer had a choice. You had me watched. I was protecting a valuable asset. I am not an asset, Claire snapped. Her voice struck the enclosed walls of the vehicle. I am a nurse. I was only trying to wash my uniform and buy groceries. Now people are shooting at me because of your war. Adrian moved with blinding speed. Before Claire could react, he had already leaned across the center console. His face stopped only inches from hers. He did not touch her, but the force of his presence pinned her against the seat. He smelled of cedar, rain, and something dark, ancient, and dangerous. You are breathing, Miss Bennett, he said in a low, lethal voice. You are inside my vehicle, not bleeding out on the floor of a laundromat. Yes, this war reached you. But you entered it the moment you opened your car door for my son. The current has you now. Stop fighting the undertow. Claire held his gaze. She was afraid, but she refused to look away. Where are we going? Adrian withdrew. The pressure filling the cabin eased. He picked up his glass again. Home. The Hawthorne Ridge estate was a fortress disguised as a mansion. 2 days later, Claire sat in a velvet chair inside a guest room larger than her entire apartment. An enormous bed occupied the center, covered in sheets whose quality she could not even begin to price. Oak bookcases lined the walls, and a clean fire burned in the marble fireplace. It was beautiful. It was luxurious. It was a cage. She had not seen the men from the laundromat again, or a single city street, or even her own clothes. Grant had provided an entire wardrobe of understated sweaters and expensive trousers that fit her far too well. The fact that someone knew her measurements unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. A soft knock sounded against the heavy wooden door. Come in, Claire said, drawing her knees closer. The door opened with a faint creak. Noah stood on the threshold. He wore grey sweatpants and a thick wool sweater. The bruises on his face had faded to yellow, and he still held one side of his body slightly stiff. He carried a silver tray with 2 porcelain cups. Martha said you did not eat breakfast, he explained quietly. She made tea. Claire's cynical armor cracked at once. She stood and took the tray before the boy had to bend. Thank you, Noah. Sit down. They settled on the edge of the bed. The tea smelled of chamomile and honey. Noah blew across his cup while watching the liquid swirl. Surrounded by the immense wealth of his father's house, he seemed smaller than he had at the bus stop in the storm. I am sorry, he said at last. For what? For making you stop. He raised his eyes. His dark gaze looked far too much like Adrian's. My father says Shaw's men shot at you because of me. Claire set down her cup and turned toward him. Listen carefully. The people who fired those shots were adults who made cruel choices. You were an 8-year-old boy walking through freezing rain, hurt and missing a shoe. I stopped because it was the right thing to do. I do not regret it. But you cannot go home now. A home is only a box where we keep our things, she lied with a reassuring smile. Someday I will find another box. Noah studied her face as though he could measure the lie. Then he nodded slowly, finished his tea, and left the room with the door slightly open. About 10 minutes later, the door opened all the way. Adrian entered. He was not wearing a jacket that day. Only a dark button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. The exposed skin was crossed by a network of old scars, reminders of wounds that had not been minor. He looked tired. It was the first time Claire had seen him as anything other than invulnerable. He did not ask permission. He walked to the chair she had vacated, sat down, and rested his forearms on his knees. He likes you, he said, watching the fire. He is a child. He likes anyone who does not treat him like collateral. Claire remained beside the bed with her arms folded. Adrian slowly turned his head. You believe I treat my own son as collateral, Miss Bennett. I think you classify everyone as either an asset or a liability, including me. Adrian did not answer immediately. He took out a silver lighter, opened it, spun the flame, and snapped it shut again. It was the first nervous gesture Claire had ever seen from him. The man from the laundromat is dead, he reported with the casualness of someone discussing the weather. Cold spread through Claire. She had spent her life fighting to keep blood inside human bodies. The offhand confession made the tea churn in her stomach. Do not tell me things like that. She looked away. You need to know them, Adrian insisted. His voice deepened, forcing her to look back at him. You need to understand that the threat against you is being removed piece by piece. Removed. What a clean word. So corporate. But it does not change what it means. You sit in this mansion, drink whiskey, and move people around like pieces while others die in alleys and laundromats. And now you have dragged me into the center of the board. Adrian rose to his feet. He crossed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps until he stopped very close to her. Claire did not retreat. She lifted her chin and held his gaze. Do you think I enjoy this? He asked. The cold mask began to fracture, revealing something hot, dangerous, and tightly contained beneath it. Do you think I want to see my son hunted through the streets? My father built this organization. I inherited a war. If I show weakness, my people die. If I hesitate for even a moment, my son dies. He raised one hand and brushed his knuckles along the edge of the small white bandage on Claire's cheek. The contact was astonishingly gentle, almost incompatible with the brutality of his words. I do not allow my people to die. I do whatever is necessary to make sure they wake the next morning. You do the same thing every night at the hospital. You fight death with scalpels and gauze. I fight it with bullets. My methods are simply less sterile. Claire swallowed with difficulty. Her heart was pounding furiously now, and not only from fear. Adrian's closeness was suffocating and magnetic at the same time. She hated his reasoning. She hated even more that, through some twisted and ruthless logic, he seemed to understand her. I am not one of your people, she whispered. Adrian looked down at her. His eyes traced the line of her jaw. His thumb moved over her uninjured cheek in a slow, heavy, possessive gesture. You are now. The hardest part of staying hidden was not the surveillance. It was the silence. For a week, Claire existed inside a suspended reality. The Hawthorne Ridge residence operated with the precision of a luxury hotel and was guarded like a military installation. Food appeared at exactly the right hour. Dirty clothes vanished and returned clean, pressed, and perfectly folded. But the silence was deafening. There were no cardiac monitors, drunken patients, or loudspeakers summoning staff to an emergency. Claire had been built for chaos. The stillness was beginning to drive her mad. She spent her afternoons walking through the library or sitting in the kitchen with Martha, the older woman who managed the household. Martha spoke little English, and Claire did not understand a word of Italian, but the two communicated through a universal language, chopping vegetables, pouring coffee, and pointing at ingredients. Adrian had become a ghost. He left before dawn and returned long after Claire had locked herself in her room. Whenever she did catch sight of him, he was bent over the desk in his study with Grant and several severe-looking men. Their voices reached her in muffled fragments through the oak doors. On the 8th night, the silence ended. It was after 2 in the morning. Claire stood in the kitchen holding a glass of water and staring absently at the enormous refrigerator when the steel door connecting the garage flew open. The impact knocked plaster from the wall. Grant stumbled inside. He had no jacket. His white shirt was soaked with bright blood spreading across his right side. He was dragging a younger man, barely past 20. A makeshift tourniquet fashioned from a belt was wrapped around the young man's thigh, completely saturated. Adrian appeared behind them. His face was streaked with soot and rainwater. His eyes were wild. He held a heavy rifle by the grip. Put him on the table, he ordered hoarsely. Grant lifted the young man and laid him on the marble island. The wounded man released a wet, frightening moan. His skin was the color of old ash. Where is Dr. Reynolds? Adrian shouted toward the hallway. About 20 minutes out, boss, a guard answered. The storm blocked the lower canyon road. He does not have 20 minutes, Claire said. Adrian turned toward her as though he had only just realized she was in the room. He opened his mouth, probably to order her away, but Claire was already moving. She did not see armed men or a kitchen full of criminals. She saw a resuscitation room. The exhausted, practical, ferocious nurse from Mercy General took control. Grant, sit down before you hit the floor, she ordered, pointing at a stool. She did not even check whether he obeyed. She approached the island and shoved Adrian in the chest to clear space. She examined the young man's leg. The belt was too low and barely tight enough. Arterial blood pulsed and weak, regular bursts across Martha's immaculate cutting boards. Hold him, she told Adrian. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Hold him now, Claire's voice carried the unquestionable authority of someone who earned her living arguing with death. Adrian moved behind the young man and forced his shoulders against the marble. Claire grabbed several towels, removed the badly placed tourniquet, and blood surged harder. The young man screamed. She drove the heel of her palm directly over the femoral artery and dropped her full body weight onto it. I need a real tourniquet. If you do not have one, bring me a thick belt and a strong spoon. Now. She did not take her eyes from the wound. Her arms began to burn as she maintained the pressure. A guard placed a wide leather belt and a wooden spoon on the marble. Working with one hand, Claire secured the belt, slid the spoon beneath it, and began twisting. She kept tightening until the leather bit into the thigh. Then she turned it once more. The bright red spurts slowed to a steady seep. Tape, rope, anything to secure it. Adrian pulled off his silk tie, wrapped it around the spoon, and fastened it to the young man's leg so the tourniquet could not loosen. Claire finally exhaled. She searched for a pulse in the young man's neck. It was rapid, weak, and thready, but it was still there. He needs fluids and a vascular surgeon. But he will not bleed out in the next 10 minutes. Her hands were covered in blood. Then she looked at Grant, hunched over the stool with one hand pressed to his ribs. She crossed to him and pulled open his soaked shirt. The bullet had grazed his side, carving a deep, ugly furrow through the flesh, but it did not appear to have struck any organs. You are going to live, she told him while pressing the wound. Grant, that enormous and unshakable man, looked at her and nodded once. It was a slow, profound gesture of respect. Claire turned to the sink and opened the tap with her elbows. She held her hands beneath the warm water and watched the blood twist into red spirals before vanishing down the steel drain. She sensed someone behind her. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to rise. Adrian stood at her shoulder, covered in dust and someone else's blood. The expression of a cornered animal had disappeared from his eyes. In its place was a burning tension she could not name. He was not looking at the wounded men. He was looking at her. He picked up a clean towel and slowly began wiping the blood from Claire's forearms. His movements were firm and methodical. You did not even tremble, he said. His deep voice cut through the sound of running water. It was only a broken pipe, she replied, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Pressure and lines. That is what I repair every night. Not when men bring violence into your kitchen. Adrian dropped the stained towel into the sink and leaned close until his lips hovered near Claire's ear. You are extraordinary when there is blood, Claire. It did not sound like a compliment meant to seduce her. It was recognition. He had seen her exactly as she was, resilient, cold when necessary, and nearly impossible to break. Claire turned to face him. Only a few inches separated them. The smells of metal, rain, and gunpowder hung between them. For the first time since she had climbed into Adrian's vehicle, Claire did not feel like a prisoner. She felt like his equal. Make sure your doctor gets here, she whispered without looking away. He is already here, a voice answered from the corridor. Dr. Reynolds rushed into the kitchen carrying 2 heavy medical bags. He stopped dead when he saw the most feared man in the city, several blood-covered men, and the missing nurse from his hospital standing beside the sink. Bennett. He blinked in disbelief. What the hell are you doing here? Claire dried her hands. I picked up an extra shift, doctor. The patients are ready. Let us get to work. 3 days later, the war reached the front door. Dominic Shaw was losing territory, money, and men. A cornered animal was always the most dangerous, and Shaw decided that if he could not win the conflict, he would cut the head from the rival organization. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, deceptively peaceful blue. Claire was in the conservatory playing a ruthless game of chess with Noah. The boy had turned out to be a small tactical genius and had just sacrificed a knight to trap Claire's queen. You left the flank open again, Noah said, lifting one hand over the board. Before he could move the piece, the oak doors burst open. Grant appeared in the doorway with a suppressed submachine gun tight against his chest. His face was completely drained of color. Safe room. Now. The silent alarm in the residence had not yet begun to flash, but Claire asked no questions. She grabbed Noah by the collar of his sweater and hauled him from a chair. They ran down the long, sun-flooded corridor. Halfway through, the front of the house exploded. The shock wave struck them like a wall. The huge reinforced windows blew inward, and a tidal wave of razor-edged glass filled the hallway. Grant threw himself over them and took most of the shards across his broad back. The deafening blast was followed immediately by the brutal rattle of automatic weapons. "Run!" Grant roared, shoving them toward a concealed door in the library. "Do not come out until Adrian or I open it from outside." Claire dragged Noah down a narrow flight of concrete stairs descending into darkness. She entered the code Adrian had forced her to memorize on her second day in the house. The steel door sealed with a hiss. The locks dropped one after another with dull, final impacts. The safe room was small and lit by emergency lamps. It smelled of trapped air and cold metal. One entire wall was covered with surveillance monitors, but nearly all the exterior cameras displayed static. The explosion had destroyed them. Noah was trembling. He sat on the bunk in the corner, drew his knees to his chest, and once again looked like the child at the bus stop. Claire sat beside him and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "Breathe. Your father built this house. It is a fortress." "Fortresses fall too," Noah whispered in a voice far too old for his age. The muffled sounds of the siege seeped through the concrete ceiling. The world seemed to be tearing itself apart above them. Heavy impacts, bursts of rifle fire, and the wet, terrible noises of close combat. Claire watched the only monitor still working. It showed the main foyer in a grainy black and white image. Smoke filled the air. The expensive rugs were covered with bodies. Then Adrian appeared on the screen. He was out of ammunition. He hurled his empty pistol into an attacker's head. When the man lost his balance, Adrian closed the distance with terrifying speed. Claire watched him fight, fascinated and horrified. It looked nothing like the clean action scenes in movies. It was dirty, brutal, and desperately efficient. Adrian used elbows, knees, and the brass base of a shattered lamp. He fought like a man willing to abandon every trace of humanity to protect what he considered his. Two more of Shaw's men came through the destroyed entrance. Adrian released the opponent he was holding and turned, but he was not fast enough. A burst of light flashed across the screen. His body jerked. He stumbled backward into the wall and left a dark stain on the white plaster. Then he slid down, clutching his abdomen. Claire stopped breathing. The two gunmen advanced slowly and raised their weapons to finish him. Before they could fire, Grant appeared from a side corridor. He did not shout. He raised his weapon and brought both men down with two precise, merciless bursts. The foyer fell silent. Grant ran to Adrian and dropped to one knee beside him. He touched the communicator on his headset. A moment later, the speaker inside the safe room crackled. Grant's voice, normally flat and unshakable, was strained. "Claire, the perimeter is secure. Adrian is badly wounded. Dr. Reynolds was killed at the entrance." Cold flooded Claire's veins. Reynolds was dead. Adrian was bleeding out. "Take him to the medical wing," she ordered. Her own voice cut through the panic and split it in two. She stood and looked at Noah. "Stay here. Lock the door after I leave. Do not open it for anyone except Grant or me." Noah nodded, his eyes wide. Claire pressed the release. The heavy door opened with a hiss. She stepped into a corridor filled with smoke. The smell was almost unbearable. Gunpowder, pulverized plaster, and the thick sweetness of torn flesh. She ran toward the small medical center Adrian had installed in the east wing. A minute later, Grant kicked open the double doors. He carried Adrian over one shoulder like a firefighter and lowered him onto the steel operating table. Adrian was pale as a corpse. His shirt had turned black with blood. He was still conscious, though his unfocused eyes stared at the lights above him. Where was he hit? Claire demanded as she grabbed a pair of scissors and cut through the shirt. "Lower left quadrant," Grant answered between breaths. "There is an exit wound in the back. I do not think it touched the spine." Claire assessed the injury. The bullet had passed through, but it had torn something important. The bleeding was severe. She had no anesthesiologist, no surgical team, and no surgeon. She had only Grant, a sterile tray, and her own hands. "I have to clamp the vessel that is bleeding." She pulled on gloves and looked at Adrian. His breathing was shallow. His chest rose in short, uneven jerks. "Adrian, look at me." His dark eyes took several seconds to focus on her face. "This is going to hurt," Claire warned. "More than anything you have ever felt. Grant, hold his shoulders." Adrian did not argue. He extended a trembling hand and gripped the steel rail. His knuckles turned white. "Do it." Claire poured an entire bottle of antiseptic over the open wound. Adrian's whole body locked rigid, and a deep growl tore from his throat, but Grant held him against the table. Claire drew a breath, took a surgical retractor and a hemostatic clamp, and then placed her hands inside the torn flesh of the man who had turned her life upside down. The war ended sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning. While Claire fought to keep Adrian's blood inside his body, Grant sent every man still capable of fighting against Dominic Shaw's final positions. Without their leader, dead on a rug in Blackwood's foyer, the rival organization fractured. Before sunrise, what remained of it had either surrendered or fled. Claire sat in a plastic chair in one corner of the medical wing. The clean uniform she had put on only hours earlier had stiffened with dried blood. Her muscles burned with a deep, rhythmic exhaustion that was almost painful. Adrian slept on the steel bed. 2 intravenous lines entered his arm, and the cardiac monitor released steady, reassuring tones. He looked terrible, pale, exhausted, and shadowed beneath the eyes. But he was breathing. The clamps had controlled the hemorrhage. The sutures were clean. Claire had pulled him back from the edge. She looked at her hands. They had stopped trembling about an hour earlier. She heard the soft rustle of sheets and lifted her head. Adrian's eyes were open. The pain medication made them heavy, but it had not dulled the sharp intelligence behind them. He slowly turned toward her. "You are still here?" he asked in a rough whisper. "Do not flatter yourself. The roads are closed." Claire leaned back in the chair. A shadow of a smile touched Adrian's lips, then tightened into a grimace as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Shaw is dead," Claire added. "Grant handled the rest. The house is secure." Adrian closed his eyes and released a long, trembling breath. The tension that had defined his entire existence seemed to leave his body with the blood he had lost. He was exhausted and hollow, but undeniably alive. When he opened his eyes again, the cold mask was completely gone. He no longer looked at her as a boss or a commander. He looked at her as a man stripped of everything until only his bones remained. "In the top drawer of the desk in my study, there is a manila envelope," he said slowly. "Grant has the key." Claire frowned. "I am not going through paperwork right now, Adrian. Listen to me." He tried to move and clenched his teeth against the pain. "Inside is a passport, a new social security number, the deed to a house in a quiet suburb in Oregon, and enough money that you will never have to work 2 shifts in a row again." Claire went still. The words hung in the sterile air. "The war is over," Adrian continued heavily. "The men who saw your face are dead. You are no longer a target. There is no reason for you to keep living in a cage. You saved my son, and you saved me. Any debt between us has been paid many times over. You are free to leave." He turned his gaze toward the surgical lights. "Grant will take you to the airport in the morning." Claire did not move. She imagined the house in Oregon, the pines, the quiet streets, and an ordinary job at an ordinary clinic where the worst emergency of the week might be a broken arm after a bicycle fall. She imagined a life in which she did not flinch at every loud noise or have to wash the smell of gunpowder from her hair. It was everything she had wanted while fleeing the gunfire behind the laundromat. It was safe. It was clean. And it felt far too much like a cemetery. She looked at the man lying on the bed. She remembered how he had fought in the foyer, with brutal and absolute loyalty toward the people he considered his own. She remembered how gently he had cleaned the blood from her arms in the kitchen. She had seen the darkest and bloodiest side of his world. In the process, she had discovered an even more frightening truth. Under pressure, Claire did not break. She bloomed. The normal, quiet, sterile life she had always defended was a lie. This room, smelling of antiseptic and iron, was the truth. She stood. The rubber soles of her shoes squeaked softly as she walked to the bed. She stopped beside Adrian. He looked at her and tightened his jaw, as though preparing himself to watch her leave. Claire reached into her pocket. She pulled out the black card with the silver numbers. Its corners were bent, and the surface had worn smooth after so many days of being pushed in and out of her jeans. She held it where Adrian could see it. "It rains too much in Oregon." Adrian's breath caught. His eyes searched Claire's face for doubt, fear, or regret. He found none. He saw only a determination as stubborn and relentless as his own. Claire leaned down slowly. She did not kiss him. She pressed her forehead against his and felt the heat of his skin and the sudden quickening of his pulse. "I am staying," she whispered against his lips. But if you ever try to send me away again, I will personally remove every stitch I just put into you. Do we understand each other?" Adrian let out a sound that was half laugh and half groan of pain. He raised his uninjured hand, tangled his fingers in Claire's hair, and drew her closer, refusing to let her pull away. It was a possessive, desperate, unbreakable gesture. "We understand each other," he breathed. Claire closed her eyes and, for the first time, stopped fighting the current. She had driven a small stranger home after finding him lost in the rain, and in doing so, she had found the place where she herself belonged. Her choice proved that the most dangerous thing in Adrian Blackwood's world was not Dominic Shaw's organization or the armed men fighting over the streets. It was the woman who could stitch his wounds without lowering her eyes. Claire traded a silent, exhausting existence for a crown forged from blood, loyalty, and irreversible choices. She became the indestructible queen that fractured empire needed in order to survive. Do you think Claire made the right decision? Or did she willingly choose a fate from which she could never escape? Share your opinion in the comments. If this story of danger, loyalty, and romance kept you watching until the end, support it with a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you do not miss the next original stories.